Hello everyone, today I'm going to talking about the research paper named corticostriatal neuron in the auditory cortex drive decisions during auditory discriminations. Basically, this research paper is talking about how the brain transforms sounds into actions, specifically how the auditory cortex communicate with the striatum to guide decisions making. First of all, on the left of the sides, there's a QR code. So if you scan the QR codes, you're able to access to the original paper, and it will give you a specific graph or data. So I think it will be really helpful. My presentation will cover the basic experiments, methods, and its main claim, and premises and critics and alternative arguments. Sound informations travel through the auditory system and reaches to the auditory cortex, but what happens next? How does the information influence to behavior? This is what the researchers want to explore. And to test this, they trained mice to recognize the different tone of frequencies and make decisions based on them. So mice tasks were they have to hear the sounds composed of the many tones. We name this as tone clouds. And if the sounds was very low frequency, like 5 to 10 kilohertz, they had to go to the left reward ports, and if it was high frequency to like 20 to 40 kilohertz, they had to go to the right reward ports. While the mice performed this task, they recorded the neural activity from auditory cortex where the sound is processed and the striatum where the brain area involved in decisions making. They also use the optogenetics, which is the techniques where they activate or deactivate the specific neurons using light to see how manipulating the auditory cortex affects to decisions making. The main arguments of the paper was the neuron from the auditory cortex to the striatum plays the important role in how choice spaces occurs in the mice decisions, and optogenetics manipulations can induce the choice spaces. My first premises is rat's auditory cortex inhibits tonotopic organization, where different areas respond to the specific frequencies while processing sounds, detections, and recognition. I thought the first premises was pretty rational and valid because the stimuli were the tone clouds, meaning the tones were not just singular monotonics, but rather a mixture of the multiple frequencies, requiring the rest to rely on the overall frequencies distributions rather than individual tones. Um, Figure 1C shows that the mice can reliably recognize the extreme frequencies as indicated by their lower errors at the both ends of the spectrum. However, when presents with the neutral frequency, somewhere between like high and the low, um, their selections varied significantly, suggesting increased decisions uncertainty in the ambiguous cases. My second premise was predictable choice bias occurs In the rat's decisions making by optogenetic methods, neuron stimulations CHR2 and inhibitions ARCH. The study found that stimulating specific sites in the auditory cortex consistently biased rats to choose the reward ports associated with the preferred frequency of the stimulations. Conversely, inactivating corticostriatal neurons bias choice away from the reward ports associated with the inactivation sites. This suggests that the corticostriatal pathways is directly involved in the decisions making, playing the key role in guiding frequency-based behavioral choices. However, I think there is a fallacies of the compositions. So first of all, I thought optogenetic is the short-term effects may not represent the long-term neural behavior. So the study assumes the temporary inhibitions or stimulations in the single pathway fully dictates behaviors, but the brain is highly adaptive. Um, Other neural network may compensate when the corticostriatal pathway is persistently inhibited or exhibited. Um, if the pathway were controlled for the longer periods, um, the other brain region might take over the decisions making. So, and um, the optogenetic inhibitions temporarily suppressed neural activity, so neuron may rebound with the increased activity after the inhibitions it's lifted or take over, potentially enhancing decisions making rather than simply just like blocking it. I thought this leads to the fallacies of compositions because the corticostriatal projections plays role in choice basis bias during the short-term manipulations, and it must be the only pathway regulating the motor decisions. In realities, the brain operates through the interconnected and redundant circuits that adapt over time. My third premise is the stardom can cut in these choice spaces even when in the auditory cortex is inactive, suggesting the possibilities that the stardom may function independently without the auditory cortex. This premise This study is controlled experiments where a specific cause, the auditory cortex, was manipulated to observe its effects, which is choice spaces, while the experiments demonstrated causality. It does not necessarily prove that the stadium functions entirely independent of the cortex. The stadium may appear to regulate choices without the cortex, but choice basis still occurs when neuron originating from the cortex were stimulated. Therefore, it cannot be concluded that stadium has been functioning independently of the cortex from the beginning. My last premise is stereo projections are widespread in the cortex and may provide the general mechanisms for the control of motor decisions by the sensory cortex. For the last premises, I would like to say it is problematic to generalize this finding to all sensory cortex, as different sensory modalities may interact with other striatum in distinct ways. The study focused only on the auditory cortex, but it does not confirm whether other sensory cortex engage with the striatums in the same manner. Sensory cortex are specialized for the different type of information processing, which may affect their connection with the striatum. The study may acknowledge that the parallel pathway could contribute to the motor decisions making, meaning that corticostriatal projections may not be the sole or even dominant mechanisms across all sensory modalities. This would be like the hasty generalizations. Just because the auditory cortex influences motor decisions through the striatum, it does not mean that all sensory cortex operate through the same mechanisms. More evidence is needed to confirm whether the relationship holds true across other sensory domains before it can be labeled as general mechanisms. In conclusions, rather than assuming that neurons from the auditory cortex to the striatum completely control choice bias, I refined my understanding as manipulating these neuron influence decisions making in a predictable short-term manners, but choice spaces arise from a combinations of the neural processes rather than single causal pathway. The finding shows that while optogenetics manipulations of the auditory cortex striatum pathway can induce the choice spaces, but this does not really necessarily means that these connections alone dictates decisions making. The brain is a highly complex system with the multiple interacting circuits, and isolating one pathway does not exclude the influence of others. This study raises critical questions about the role of striatum in decisions making and the extent to which it functions independently from the auditory cortex. Additionally, our causal interpretations must consider the potential third variables that could be influencing choice spaces beyond the direct neural interpretations. I welcome your thoughts and insight on these questions. And thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives. Thank you.